All I wanted was a quiet Saturday, just me, my coffee, my fishing rod, and some peace. Simple, right? But no, and next thing I know, I'm getting ambushed on my own dock by a woman in stilettos clutching a clipboard, shouting HOA violations like she worked for the FBI. I remember standing there thinking, is this actually happening? It only got more ridiculous from that point on, because an hour later, I would discover something in my attic that would shake our cozy lakeside community to its core. If you've ever had a neighbor who takes things way too seriously, this story might hit home. Let me know in the comments if it's just me, because seriously this was next level. Anyway, here's how it all started. Before I finally saved up enough to buy my dream lake house, I'd been eyeing this spot for years. 2 years ago, I bought this place from a sweet old man named Earl, a veteran who had lived here since the 1940s. Earl had this warm presence, and he lit up the moment I told him how much I loved fishing. He gave me a grin and said, "Son, you're gonna love this lake." Then he paused, gazing out over the water like he was reliving a memory. "There's some old paperwork in the attic if you ever need it," he said. Sometimes, the past has a way of looking out for the future. At the time, I chalked it up to wise old man advice about keeping good records. But now, after everything that's happened, I'm starting to think Earl was trying to tell me something more. I can still picture the look on his face as I hold this letter Miranda gave me, her so-called HOA violation notice. Back then, Earl had started to say more but held himself back, shaking his head like he didn't want to drag me into something. "Just enjoy that water, son," he said instead. "It's been good to my family for generations." That line stuck with me. Not that he loved the lake, but that it had been good to his family. Was there some kind of history he didn't want to lay on me? A pattern of people trying to take control over what didn't belong to them? My boat isn't anything fancy, it's a 96 tracker, but I take good care of it. It's my pride and joy. It sits peacefully on my dock, which is on my own private property, and for the last 2 years, not a single soul had a problem with it. In fact, the neighbors always seemed pleasant, a typical friendly waves and nods. I specifically chose this place because Earl had told me I could dock my boat without any trouble. His family had done the same for generations. It just seemed like common sense. But standing there, holding that letter, I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I missed some rule. Or maybe Miranda was just one of those people who says things so forcefully that you start to doubt reality. Every time I'd seen her, she looked like a model for an HOA newsletter. Flawless hair, clipboard in a death grip, like she was on some kind of patrol. That morning, as she marched onto my dock, she recited violations like she was quoting maritime law. She announced, with all the flair of a TV villain, that as HOA president, she had full authority over all waterfront matters impacting community standards and property values. She kept saying our lake and community property like she owned the shoreline, which, frankly, annoyed me, especially since I paid extra to live on the lake. What really irked me, though, was how she treated my confusion like it was a red flag. Like the mere act of asking questions proved I was some disrespectful rule breaker. And it wasn't like she was trying to work things out civilly. She handed me this printed letter on official-looking HOA stationery, filled with violation codes and legal jargon, giving me 7 days to remove my boat or else face immediate enforcement action. Whatever that meant. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. Like I was trespasser on my own property. She said it was non-negotiable, flashing this smug little smile that made me want to ask who exactly voted her queen of the lake. Then she said, "The community has spoken, and your boat doesn't meet the standards." What community? I never got any emails or flyers about meetings. There was no mention of boat restrictions. For 2 full years, not a single complaint. Now, suddenly, I'm a threat to the whole neighborhood aesthetic? She kept referring to our lake and acted like she had say over my private dock. But I bought lakefront land specifically to access the lake. That's the whole reason people pay more for waterfront property. Why pay a premium if you can't even use the water? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. When did HOAs start governing private docks? When did vague community standards override individual property rights? As I stood there, watching her walk off like she owned the place, something didn't sit right. Earl had always been confident about my rights here. He lived through the evolution of this neighborhood. If there had been lake access restrictions, he would have known. Maybe it was finally time to see what those attic papers were really about. I should have checked sooner, but I'm not the kind to stir up drama. I just wanted to fish, relax, and be left alone. But something about Miranda's attitude and her constant claims of authority made me rethink everything Earl had said. Maybe those documents weren't just old family keepsakes. Maybe Earl left them behind for a reason, or because he knew one day I might need them. I didn't realize it yet, but what was waiting in that attic wasn't just dusty paperwork, it was the blueprint to take down her hoe. Sunday morning, instead of relaxing, I was elbow deep in dusty attic boxes when I found something unexpected: a weathered metal file box labeled property documents, a keepsake in faded handwriting that looked eerily like my grandfather's. Inside were old papers, some nearly crumbling, dating back to 1948. Every single one had the name Rodriguez on it, my grandfather's name. I didn't know much about my family's roots in this area, but it turns out my grandfather, Manuel, had once owned a surprising amount of land right here long before I was ever born. The papers smelled like age and forgotten history. As I lugged the heavy box down the attic stairs, careful not to spill a lifetime of documents, questions were already spinning in my mind. Why hadn't my dad ever told me about this? What else had I never been told? Just as I was awkwardly wrestling the box through the doorway, my neighbor Maria spotted me through her kitchen window. She came outside with that motherly concern you only get from older women who think you're on the verge of throwing out your back. "Your abuelo had land here?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. I nodded and told her about Miranda's surprise visit and the threatening letter she left. That friendly curiosity in Maria's face instantly shifted. What replaced it was something sharp, like a switch had flipped. Her eyes narrowed with a kind of quiet fire I wasn't expecting. "Mayo," she said, shaking her head slowly, the way only someone with years of experience dealing with nonsense can. "I worked at the county office for 30 years, and something about that woman's so-called authority doesn't sit right." That's when it started to click. Maybe Miranda wasn't nearly as powerful as she made herself out to be. "Wait," I asked, still processing what Maria was saying. "You think she doesn't actually have authority over my boat?" Maria gave me this look of half pity, half amusement. "Honey," she said, "let me explain something about property rights and people who like making up rules that don't exist." Turns out, Maria was exactly the person you'd want on your side in a situation like this. No nonsense, razor sharp, and totally unfazed by hoe drama wrapped in legalese. 65, retired from county administration, and deeply familiar with the inner workings of land records, she had zero patience for people who throw around power they don't have. "I've handled more deeds, zoning maps, and ownership filings than I can count," she said as we laid my grandfather's papers across the kitchen table. "And from what I'm seeing here, this documentation is solid." The most important piece was a deed from 1948, signed by Manuel Rodriguez and stamped with an official county seal. But this wasn't just any deed. As I read through the dense, old-fashioned legal language, something began to snap into focus. "Wait," I asked Maria, trying to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. "This says I don't just have access to the Lakea broken bar, I actually own it?" Maria nodded, common matter of fact, not borrow, not lease own. "And these people have been acting like it's theirs." Suddenly, a childhood memory hit me, something buried so deep I hadn't thought of it in years. I was about 8. My dad had taken me fishing at a lake up north, and at one point, he pointed across the water and said something like, "My father used to own a lake down south, had to give it up when times got hard." I had assumed it was just one of those dad stories, a half-true, half-myth, the kind that make grandpas sound bigger than life. But now a broken bar, what if it wasn't fiction? What if my grandfather really did own this lake? And somewhere along the line, the truth got lost? "My dad never told me any of this," I said quietly. "He passed away 5 years ago. Not once did he mention lake ownership, or anything about rights to this land." Maria gave me a soft, knowing look. "That happens more often than you think," she said. "Sometimes people don't talk about property they think they've lost. Or maybe your father assumed it was tied up in red tape he couldn't sort through." She explained that families often lose track of old land rights when generations move away or when properties get absorbed into newer developments. It made me realize how many truths have we forgotten just because no one knew to look for them. And if the documents were right, then Miranda's bold claims about HOA control over community waterfront rules meant nothing. Legally, she had no jurisdiction. Zero. Her threats of enforcement action were basically noise from someone bluffing without a clue. Your grandfather's land predates the neighborhood, Maria said, tapping the survey maps. This whole development was built after your family's property was already established. And ownership doesn't disappear just because people start assuming it's shared. She offered to help me sort things out with the county, said she still had a few friends in the system who could help verify and fast-track the records. I told her I wanted to be absolutely certain before I went public with any of these. The last thing I wanted was to be wrong and start a fight based on a misunderstanding. But Maria seemed sure, crystal clear, confident in a way that made me believe we were standing on solid legal ground. I looked at Maria, trying to fully grasp what this meant. So Miranda really has no authority over my boat? I asked. Maria actually chuckled. Sweetheart, if these documents say what I think they do, Miranda doesn't just lack authority over your boat, she has no say over anything that happens on that lake. We spent the rest of Sunday carefully making multiple copies of every document, organizing everything by date, and preparing to take it all to the county office first thing Monday. Maria was absolutely glowing with energy. It was clear she'd been waiting years for someone to finally challenge Miranda's over-the-top control tactics. Let her keep digging her own hole, Maria said with a grin only decades of dealing with neighborhood drama could produce. Then we'll show everyone what's actually true. By Monday afternoon, we were sitting in the county records office with Janet, a longtime friend of Maria's who had worked there since the 80s and practically had the entire archive system memorized. Janet handled the deed with care, scanning it with the kind of trained eye that comes from years of handling old, delicate legal documents. This is 100% authentic, she said confidently, pointing to embossed seals and matching signatures. And absolutely binding under county law. She pulled up digital archives that traced the ownership clearly, from my grandfather Manuel, to my father, and now legally to me. Everything was documented, nothing missing, no loopholes. Janet gave a knowing smile. Your friend Miranda, she said, clearly using the term friend loosely, has zero legal standing to tell you or anyone else what to do with your lake. And just like that, everything shifted. The timing couldn't have been better, either. Miranda had already scheduled an emergency community meeting for Tuesday night. What she didn't know was that her carefully staged HOA performance was about to backfire big time. Tuesday evening, the local community center was absolutely buzzing. It looked like the entire neighborhood had shown up. Every chair was filled, even the usually silent mailman came with a notepad, ready to take notes like it was a courtroom hearing. You could feel it in the air. This wasn't just a meeting, this was going to be a showdown. People were chatting, snacking, whispering, as if they were settling in for a live drama. Over 60 neighbors filled the room, all eyes on the front where Miranda stood with the confidence of a CEO preparing to drop quarterly results. She'd gone all out. There was a full PowerPoint titled Maintaining Community Standards projected on the screen. Enlarged photos of my boat, carefully taken from unflattering angles, were plastered across the slides like it was some kind of environmental threat. She even included charts showing alleged property value decline, all with red arrows and scary numbers, and excerpts from HOA bylaws that looked official enough to convince anyone who didn't know better. To her credit, Miranda's presentation was polished, but beneath all the graphs and jargon, it was built on nothing but bluster. This isn't about one resident, she said with artificial concern, gesturing toward the photos, but we cannot allow individuals to make unsanctioned decisions that endanger our neighborhood's long-term financial health. She made it sound like my fishing boat was a hazard to suburban society. I watched as some people took notes, others nodded cautiously. For a moment, it looked like she might sway the room. Then she called my name, adding theatrical emphasis like she was introducing the villain in a drama. I stood up slowly, adrenaline kicking in as I felt dozens of eyes lock onto me. Actually, Miranda, I began, doing my best to keep my voice calm, I think it's time we talked about who really has legal authority over the lake." The room fell silent, not a single cough, not even a shuffle. Miranda's confident expression faltered. For the briefest second, I saw something flicker across her face, in uncertainty, maybe even fear. "Mr. Torres," she snapped, voice suddenly sharp, "this meeting is for discussing compliance with established HOA guidelines, and not for undermining lawful authority." But I noticed her blink twice, rapidly, and her grip on that presentation remote had tightened noticeably. That's when I reached into my folder and raised a document high for all to see. "This," I said, "is an original property deed dated 1948, filed with the county, sealed, and signed, clearly stating that my grandfather, Manuel Rodriguez, purchased this land and all the water rights that come with it." Gasps spread across the room. Neighbors leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. The room was no longer on her side. "This isn't about opinions," I added, my voice louder now, firm. "This is documented, recorded, and predates the formation of this HOA by decades." I could literally see the blood drain from Miranda's face. Her composure cracked just slightly, but enough. As the weight of the revelation settled over the room, Miranda's mouth opened slightly, like she wanted to interrupt, but nothing came out. Then she tried to regain control, but the panic was obvious. "That deed is 75 years old," she snapped, voice tight and rising. "There has to be something, an agreement, a clause, an easement, anything." Her voice cracked. She was reaching, and everyone could see it. That's when Maria stood up from the back, calm and composed, the kind of presence that silences a room. People turned toward her, and I saw the flicker of recognition spread. They remembered her years at the county office had made her a trusted name. "Actually, Miranda," she said, her voice echoing through the community center, "I worked in county records for over 3 decades. And I can tell you this, property ownership doesn't magically expire with age." She gestured toward me. "Mike inherited that lake through perfectly legal, properly documented channels." The murmuring grew louder. I heard someone whisper, "The broken bar, he owns the lake." If that was true, and the paperwork certainly said it was, then everything Miranda had built this meeting on was based on a false premise. Her PowerPoint presentation, with its dramatic graphs and angry arrows, suddenly felt like a stage prop for a story that wasn't even real. I stepped forward, fueled by the shift in energy. "Show me your proof, Miranda," I said, voice steady. "Where is the legal documentation that gives you any authority over my private land?" You could feel the room start to lean with me. Miranda blinked twice, then tried to pivot. She launched into some vague explanation about community precedent and HOA oversight of shared spaces. But when asked to present actual legal documentation, the only thing she produced were generic incorporation documents, and none of which confirmed community ownership of the lake. "There has to be some kind of public easement filed with the county," she insisted, clearly floundering now. "Maybe a long-standing usage clause, or an implied access agreement." A broken bar. She was spiraling. Then Bob Henderson stood up, a longtime resident. The guy had lived here longer than anyone I knew. "Hold on," he said, looking around the room with rising frustration. "Are you saying we've been enforcing rules based on the assumption that the HOA owns the lake without any real proof?" His words cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned to Miranda, waiting for an answer she couldn't give. "Miranda," I said again, more firmly this time, "if you can't point to a single legal document showing your authority over my land, then your threats or your letters, they mean nothing." People who had been nodding during her presentation now looked uncomfortable, embarrassed even. Several glanced at the door like they couldn't wait to leave. "This requires a thorough legal review," Miranda finally announced, her voice stiff with forced authority. "No further comments will be made until the HOA board has consulted its legal team. This meeting is adjourned." And just like that, she tried to shut it all down. But you could tell if this wasn't over. The room erupted with whispers and conversation as neighbors turned to each other, confused and curious. As people began filing out, several came up to me. Some apologized for not speaking up earlier. Others asked about the lake's history or wanted to see the deed for themselves. An older man gently pulled me aside. "I always thought it was strange how separate the lake felt from the rest of the subdivision," he said. Now I get Ida, it was never part of it. As I stood there surrounded by neighbors, answering questions, listening to their stories, I realized something deeper had shifted. It wasn't just about legal rights anymore. People were starting to wake up, and Miranda knew it. Her face said everything: panic, shock, disbelief. She had picked the wrong person to push around, but I had no idea what she'd do next. By Thursday, she'd gone full nuclear. That morning, as I sat sipping coffee, a certified letter arrived, thick, intimidating, and way too formal. I held it for a few minutes, heart pounding. The envelope felt heavier than it should, like it was dragging bad news behind it. When I finally opened it, I had to read it 3 times. It was from her brother-in-law's law firm. Apparently, Miranda was taking this to court. The letter was full of heavy legal jargon, threats, and accusations. She was demanding that I prove ownership through formal legal proceedings. The claims included things like adverse possession, community access precedent, and public interest easements. It was clearly designed to intimidate, to make me panic, second-guess myself, and fold. One paragraph even accused me of malicious interference with community governance. You'd think I was trying to overthrow a government, not park a fishing boat. But here's the thing: Maria had introduced me to someone, a property lawyer named David Chen. When I showed him the letter, he actually laughed. "Yeah, no," David said, shaking his head. "This is classic bluffing. Your title is solid. These legal arguments she's throwing at you, completely baseless." He explained that adverse possession requires very specific, legally defined circumstances, and none of them applied here. Not even close. That should have made me feel completely at ease. But there was something about Miranda's letter, something unsettling. The tone wasn't just aggressive, it felt personal, like she wasn't just trying to win. She was trying to crush me, and I had a feeling she wasn't done. Part of me wanted to just let it all go of the boat, let Miranda have her little hoe fantasy world, and slip back into my quiet weekends. But I knew that the moment I backed down, I'd be giving them permission to cross every line in the future. I'd never get to fish in peace again. That's when Miranda made it personal, and that's when this whole neighborhood feud crossed the line into something darker, something criminal. Late Friday night, around 11 p.m., I was relaxing, watching a movie, when I heard this strange scraping noise from outside, somewhere near the dock. At first, I thought it might be raccoons messing with the trash again, but the sound had this rhythm, too precise, too mechanical. It didn't sound like animals. I grabbed a flashlight and glanced out the window. Nothing looked off, and when I flicked on the porch light, the sound stopped. Just silence. It wasn't until Saturday morning that I realized what had actually happened. My dock lines weren't just frayed, they were cleanly slashed. A sharp blade or heavy-duty scissors, no doubt. My boat was leaning sideways, lightly thudding against the dock with each gentle ripple. And then I saw it. Deep gouges scraped into the hull, down to the fiberglass. Someone had even tampered with the fuel tank. It reeked of sugar or sand. This wasn't vandalism. It was calculated sabotage. Whoever did this wanted to make sure I did, not just financially, but emotionally. They knew exactly what they were doing. The damage? $1,800 in repairs. A hard hit to my budget. But what really gutted me wasn't the cost, it was the invasion. Someone had deliberately come onto my dock, my property, under cover of night, to destroy something I loved. It wasn't just a boat. It was my escape, my peace. The one place I came to breathe. I called the police immediately and filed a full report, complete with photos and a list of damages. Officer Martinez showed up, sympathetic but realistic. Without witnesses or cameras, he said, "These cases usually don't go anywhere. We'll step up patrols, but unless someone talks or we get lucky, it'll probably stay unsolved." And that just made it worse. It wasn't about the repairs. It was the thought that someone in this neighborhood, as someone I probably smiled at while checking the mail, hated me enough to do this. The legal threats were one thing. This was personal. Most of the neighbors were horrified. A few came by to offer their sympathy and ask if I needed help. But not Miranda. She said nothing, and when I passed her at the mailbox that afternoon, she couldn't even look me in the eye. Desperate people do stupid things. Maria told me that evening, her voice heavy with experience. "She's showing her true colors." That was the moment I knew I needed to take security seriously. Over the weekend, I installed a full surveillance system, motion-activated lights, cameras, alarm synced to my phone, the works. It set me back another $1,800, but I wasn't taking chances anymore. Insurance helped with the boat repairs, but the deductible stung. And sure enough, just a few days later, that investment paid off. At 5:30 a.m., my cameras recorded 3 people creeping onto my dock, tools in hand, moving like they were trying not to be seen. When I reviewed the footage, I immediately recognized 2 of the irregulars at home meetings, Miranda's inner circle. The third, I'd bet money it was her teenage nephew. Faces were clear, intent was obvious. They weren't out for a walk, they were here to do something. When I brought the footage to the police, Officer Martinez was impressed but cautious. "It's strong evidence," he said, "but since one of them's a minor and the others are well known in the community, it gets tricky." Proving criminal intent becomes a battle when reputations are involved. I was furious, but Maria had a different idea, one that shifted the whole direction of this fight. "Mayo," she said, tapping the stack of old property documents, "if you're going to fight this the right way, you need to know exactly what your family owned. Let's get a professional survey, find the boundaries, all of them." At first, it sounded like overkill. I already knew we owned the lake, right? But Maria just smiled knowingly. "Your grandfather didn't just buy the lake, he bought 15 acres back in 1948. You'd be surprised what those old boundaries include." So, I hired a surveyor, an incredibly detailed guy named Robert, who brought GPS equipment, mapping tools, and a metal detector to track down original boundary markers buried decades ago. "This is interesting," Robert said on day 2, kneeling near an old flower bed. "We're finding iron markers under shrubs, fences, even decorative landscaping, like someone didn't want them found." On the third day, he called me over, serious expression on his face. "Mr. Torres," he said carefully, "you may want to sit down for this." "You might want to sit down for this," Robert said, eyes locked on mine. "Your property extends much farther than anyone realizes, and this is way bigger than a boat dispute." The security footage had already shown exactly who was behind the sabotage, but what I was about to uncover next made that look like a petty squabble. Monday morning, I met Robert at his office to go over the finalized property survey, and the look on his face told me something major was coming. Laid out in front of him were the original 1948 deed, satellite maps, and GPS overlays of modern property lines. He'd clearly double-checked, maybe even triple-checked everything. This wasn't a typical land dispute. This was the kind of anomaly that made even veteran surveyors doubt their tools. "Mr. Torres," he began slowly, "what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible." He picked up a pencil and traced a boundary line on a map. My eyes followed Ida and kept following Ida past the lake, past the dock, around the wooded area behind the development, a broken bar. "Your grandfather's 15-acre purchase didn't just include the lake," Robert said. "It includes the land under the HOA clubhouse." I blinked. "I'm sorry, a broken bar what?" He nodded, then slid the map closer. "The tennis courts, the parking lot, the pool, the entire community center complex, it was all inside the legal boundary of my inherited land." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because my brain needed some way to process what I was hearing. "You're saying that every home meeting, every pool party, every community event in the last 5 years happened on my land?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Robert replied, with the calm professionalism of someone used to dropping legal bombs. It was surreal, the very ground Miranda stood on while threatening me, mine. The irony wasn't just delicious, it was divine. "Let me get this straight," I said, leaning over the desk. "Every time Miranda waved around those HOA bylaws and threatened enforcement, she was doing it on my property?" "Correct," Robert confirmed. "And there's no record in any that the HOA ever purchased or even leased the land. Your grandfather's deed is still legally binding. No subdivision, no sale, no easement, nothing." He walked me through the historical markers and modern GPS confirmations. Everything lined up. The developers had either ignored or never properly verified the original property boundaries, and the HOA had been squatting on private land for years so without even knowing it. Honestly, Robert added, this happens more than people think. Developers rush builds, assume land is clear, and the paperwork never catches up. But this, he gestured to the map, this is a massive oversight. Suddenly, something Earl once said came back to me, something vague about people trying to build on family land years ago. Maybe he had known, maybe that's why he looked so uncomfortable when I first mentioned the attic papers. Maybe he fought this and eventually gave up. Now, I wasn't just a guy with a boat on a lake, I was a guy who legally owned the entire hub of HOA operations. Not only had they been holding meetings and building structures on my land, but I'd unknowingly been paying property taxes for all of it. They'd installed a pool, a tennis court, a clubhouse on my property without my knowledge or permission. I called David Chen immediately. David, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I was furious, but Maria had a different idea, one that shifted the whole direction of this fight. Mayo, she said, tapping the stack of old property documents, if you're going to fight this the right way, you need to know exactly what your family owned. Let's get a professional survey, find the boundaries. All of them. At first, it sounded like overkill. I already knew we owned the lake, right? But Maria just smiled knowingly. Your grandfather didn't just buy the lake, he bought 15 acres back in 1948. You'd be surprised what those old boundaries include. So, I hired a surveyor, an incredibly detailed guy named Robert, who brought GPS equipment, mapping tools, and a metal detector to track down original boundary markers buried decades ago. This is interesting, Robert said on day 2, kneeling near an old flower bed. We're finding iron markers under shrubs, fences, even decorative landscaping, like someone didn't want them found. On the third day, he called me over, serious expression on his face. Mr. Torres, he said carefully, you may want to sit down for this. You might want to sit down for this, Robert said, eyes locked on mine. Your property extends much farther than anyone realizes, and this is way bigger than a boat dispute. The security footage had already shown exactly who was behind the sabotage, but what I was about to uncover next made that look like a petty squabble. Monday morning, I met Robert at his office to go over the finalized property survey, and the look on his face told me something major was coming. Laid out in front of him were the original 1948 deed, satellite maps, and GPS overlays of modern property lines. He'd clearly double-checked, maybe even triple-checked everything. This wasn't a typical land dispute. This was the kind of anomaly that made even veteran surveyors doubt their tools. Mr. Torres, he began slowly, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. He picked up a pencil and traced a boundary line on the map. My eyes followed Ida and kept following Ida past the lake, past the dock, around the wooded area behind the development, a broken bar. Your grandfather's 15-acre purchase didn't just include the lake, Robert said. It includes the land under the HOA clubhouse. I blinked. I'm sorry, a broken bar what? He nodded, then slid the map closer. The tennis courts, the parking lot, the pool, the entire community center complex, it was all inside the legal boundary of my inherited land. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because my brain needed some way to process what I was hearing. You're saying that every home meeting, every pool party, every community event in the last 5 years happened on my land? That's exactly what I'm saying, Robert replied, with the calm professionalism of someone used to dropping legal bombs. It was surreal, the very ground Miranda stood on while threatening me, mine. The irony wasn't just delicious, it was divine. Let me get this straight, I said, leaning over the desk. Every time Miranda waved around those HOA bylaws and threatened enforcement, she was doing it on my property? Correct, Robert confirmed. And there's no record in Omnia that the HOA ever purchased or even leased the land. Your grandfather's deed is still legally binding. No subdivision, no sale, no easement, nothing. He walked me through the historical markers and modern GPS confirmations. Everything lined up. The developers had either ignored or never properly verified the original property boundaries, and the HOA had been squatting on private land for years so without even knowing it. Honestly, Robert added, this happens more than people think. Developers rush builds, assume land is clear, and the paperwork never catches up. But this, he gestured to the map, this is a massive oversight. Suddenly, something Earl once said came back to me, something vague about people trying to build on family land years ago. Maybe he had known, maybe that's why he looked so uncomfortable when I first mentioned the attic papers. Maybe he fought this and eventually gave up. Now, I wasn't just a guy with a boat on a lake, I was a guy who legally owned the entire hub of HOA operations. Not only had they been holding meetings and building structures on my land, but I'd unknowingly been paying property taxes for all of it. They'd installed a pool, a tennis court, a clubhouse on my property without my knowledge or permission. I called David Chen immediately. "David," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you're not going to believe this." "Try me," he replied, sounding almost amused. "They built the entire HOA complex, clubhouse, pool, tennis court on my land." Long pause. "You're kidding." "Nope. Full GPS survey, matches the 1948 deed." The land was never subdivided. I could hear rustling on his end, papers being shuffled, maybe a keyboard being hammered. "Jesus," David muttered, "you could legally demand they remove everything. You could dissolve the entire HOA infrastructure with one court motion." And that's when it hit me. I didn't just have leverage, I had nuclear leverage. I had never held this kind of power in my life, not in business, not with money, not in any conflict. But now I held a kind of card that made tyrants sweat. When I told Maria, her reaction said everything. "This is absolutely insane," I said, showing her the maps. Every time Miranda called a meeting to order, she was standing on my land. Maria's grin stretched wide. "I told you the truth would surface, Mayo. That woman's been running on arrogance and assumption, and now, she's about to learn what facts feel like." Now came the real challenge, how to wield this nuclear truth with precision. I could go scorched earth and demand immediate eviction of all HOA operations, shut down the pool, bulldoze the tennis courts, but that would punish the innocent neighbors who'd been using those amenities in good faith. They didn't know they were swimming, lounging, and hosting birthday parties on stolen land. Still, I couldn't just let Miranda keep swinging her gavel like a queen in a paper crown, especially not after everything she'd done. David Chen suggested a more strategic approach. "Let her make the next move," he said. "Let her dig her hole a little deeper, and then drop everything, a deed, survey, legal documents in one clean, undeniable strike, public, irrefutable." As if on cue, Miranda scheduled another emergency home meeting for Friday night. The topic, final enforcement actions against Mr. Torres. Her goal, strip me of all so-called violations and force compliance once and for all. The irony? She planned to hold that meeting in my clubhouse, on my land, the one she had no idea she was trespassing on. So I spent the week prepping, organizing the deed, survey maps, GPS-verified boundary documents, and photo evidence of original markers. Word had already started to circulate about the land survey, along with whispers about Miranda's increasingly erratic threats. She was trying to rally the neighborhood against me, painting me as a disruptive outsider, a threat to their community. I almost felt sorry for her, almost, but by now, the crowd was watching. The stage was set, and the best counterpunch is always the one they never see coming. Friday evening, I walked into the my clubhouse carrying a folder full of truth and a calm I didn't entirely feel. Over 80 neighbors packed the room, most expecting Miranda to publicly crush me into submission. At the front of the room stood Miranda, flanked by her smug husband and a lawyer who looked like he charged by the syllable. She was glowing with confidence, the kind of fake power that only thrives in the dark. "Tonight," she declared dramatically, "we resolve the Torres boat issue once and for all." The crowd murmured in anticipation. "Mr. Torres will either comply with established community standards," she continued, "or face the full legal consequences of his continued defiance." And there it was at the moment. She was threatening me with legal action, while literally trespassing on my property to do it. Her presentation was slick: enlarged photos of my boat, pie charts showing imagined property value drops, and printouts of vague enforcement clauses pulled from HOA bylaws. Her lawyer backed her up with long-winded talk about covenants, obligations, and legal precedent, clearly meant to overwhelm me through sheer paperwork and legalese. The community has been more than patient with Mr. Torres, Miranda proclaimed, dialing up the drama. But patience has limits when one resident's selfishness threatens everyone else's financial investment. People in the crowd nodded, some shaking their heads at me like I was the villain in all this. And then she turned to me. "Mr. Torres," she said, smug as ever, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" I stood slowly. My heartbeat was a drum in my ears, but my hands didn't shake. I held the folder like a sword. "Actually, yes," I said, "but before we talk about boats, I think we need to establish who actually has legal authority here." I pulled out the first documented in 1948 deed and held it high. "This is the original, counter-recorded property deed issued to my grandfather, Manuel Rodriguez. It shows he purchased the entire 3-acre lake and the surrounding land more than 75 years ago." Murmurs spread through the room like wildfire, necks craned, eyes widened. "According to this," I continued, my voice louder now, "I don't just have access to the lake, I own it, all of it." I looked directly at Miranda. Her face was tight, her lips pressed into a hard line, but she tried to recover, clinging to her script. "We've researched this extensively," she snapped. "Decades of community use establish public access. It falls under adverse possession and established use precedents." Her lawyer nodded like it made sense, but from the back of the room, I could see David Chen shaking his head slowly. "That might sound convincing to people who don't know property law," I said, "but it's legally meaningless here. My family's ownership is documented, verified, and never transferred or surrendered." I let the silence hang very long and heavy before I slowly unfolded the next page in my folder. I unfolded the survey map corner by corner like I was presenting evidence at a criminal trial. "This isn't just about the lake," I said, letting each word drop with deliberate weight. "This building we're sitting in, I own every inch of it." Silence, not the uncomfortable kind and stunned, disbelieving kind, the kind that stretches long because no one knows what to say. People leaned forward to get a better look at the survey documents, the GPS coordinates, the clearly marked boundary lines. Every home meeting, every birthday party, every enforcement vote Miranda ever held a broken bar had all happened on land she didn't own. Her smile twitched, then vanished. She opened her mouth like she wanted to speak, then closed it again, stunned into momentary silence. "This is fake," she blurted finally, her voice cracking halfway through. "It has to be. There's a broken bar, there's no way." But her tone betrayed her. It wasn't defiance anymore, it was panic, and her doubt was contagious. You could see it spread across the room as neighbors glanced at each other, processing what this meant. Even her expensive lawyer wasn't backing her up. He was flipping through the survey pages with a deepening frown. "This is absolutely impossible," Miranda shouted, but it only made things worse. Her cool, commanding mask was crumbling in real time. "We have documentation. We have incorporation records," she insisted. But when her lawyer quietly asked her to produce them, all she could come up with were General HOA incorporation papers and nothing that actually proved ownership of the land. Nothing that showed a lease, an easement, or even permission. "Where are the lease agreements, Miranda?" I asked, calm but direct. "Where's the documentation giving the HOA the right to use this land, build on it, host meetings here?" The room reacted like someone had yanked the curtain back on The Wizard of Oz. A man near the back stood up. "Have we been repainting his clubhouse with our HOA fees?" Someone laughed, not a casual laugh, a shocked, stunned bark of disbelief. Another voice chimed in, "She's been running this place like a dictator. Turns out she didn't even own the palace." Laughter erupted. Nervous, then real, then angry. "Are you telling me we've been paying dues to improve someone else's private property?" A woman demanded. "How much money have we poured into this place over the years?" Another neighbor asked. Furious now, Miranda's own inner circle looked shaken. You could see the loyalty unraveling right in front of her. "I was told the clubhouse was community-owned," one man said, voice rising. "That's why I bought here. She told us it was built with community funds." Another neighbor added, betrayal written all over his face. The avalanche of realization crushed whatever grip Miranda thought she had left. In one last grasp at control, she barked, "These documents could be forgeries, sophisticated fraud. This is a coordinated attack on our peaceful community." She sounded completely unhinged. "Mike Torres is trying to steal this property through legal manipulation and document fraud," she shrieked. But her lawyer wasn't following her off the cliff. He closed the folder, exhaled, and spoke with careful clarity. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his tone professional but cool, "this evidence appears to be valid. The boundaries are clearly defined and properly recorded. Legally, this land belongs to Mr. Torres." Even her husband, the always silent, always supportive husband, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The reality was setting in. "Miranda," he whispered urgently, "we need to talk about this, in private." But it was far too late for that. Maria stood up and added the final nail, a first-hand confirmation of the deed and ownership chain, processed under her watch at the county records office decades ago. Her quiet authority sealed everything I'd presented. That was the moment it all unraveled. The room broke into chaos, some neighbors shouting, others demanding answers. Dozens began questioning how they could have been misled so thoroughly for so long. "Emergency vote." Someone yelled. "Motion for no confidence in current leadership." Another added, "It wasn't even close." The vote, 73-4. Miranda was removed from all HOA leadership positions immediately. Her few remaining supporters slunk out without a word. And as the chaos subsided, residents turned to me with apologies, actual apologies for the years of harassment, for believing her, for never checking the facts. And Miranda? She sat in the front row, face flushed crimson, staring blankly ahead and muttering something about lawsuits and conspiracies. She looked like a monarch who'd just realized the kingdom was never hers to rule. Her reign was over. But her meltdown? Oh, that was just beginning. Miranda looked like someone completely unhinged, eyes wild, breathing uneven. Her husband, the bank manager, finally pulled her aside, whispering urgently, "Miranda, we need to cut our losses now." You could tell he was terrified of being dragged down with her. But Miranda? She was beyond reason. Her pride wouldn't let her process reality. She turned back one last time, flung a desperate line over her shoulder. "This isn't over." Oh, but it was. Everyone in that room knew it. What happened next showed the difference between justice and revenge. Yeah, and I chose justice. I had every right to evict the HOA, shut down the clubhouse, drain the pool, and call it today. But that would have punished the entire neighborhood for one woman's lies. So instead, I stood before the crowd and said, $50 a month to lease the clubhouse. Or, if you'd rather, we can talk about relocating it to HOA-owned land. The relief was instant. People had been terrified they'd lose their community space because of Miranda's arrogance. I told them plainly, I'm not here to be the new dictator. I just want respect for my property rights and an end to the harassment. We drafted a new lease agreement. It included fair lake access, noise rules, and environmental guidelines. Any future clubhouse improvements, written permission required, like it should have been all along. No trespassing charges were filed because honestly, most of the community had been misled. They thought this land was HOA property. They acted in good faith. Miranda's permanent ban from community leadership was voted in with near unanimous support. One resident summed it up best: "She lied to us for years about basic facts. How can we trust anything else?" she said. The financial toll of her deception was staggering. Tens of thousands in HOA dues spent improving my land. The new leadership brought in transparency protocols, real financial oversight, and fact-checking measures. "Maria?" She was glowing with satisfaction. "I knew you'd take the high road, Mayo," she said. "You could have burned it all down, but instead, you built something better." Neighborhood barbecues came back, at this time fun, not tense. People smiled, waved, spoke freely. For the first time in years, property lines were respected, and fear was replaced by trust. Some neighbors admitted they'd been too afraid to challenge Miranda before, said she ruled by intimidation. Not anymore. Miranda's fall was fast and brutal. Former friends ghosted her. Social invites disappeared. Her reputation, torched. And once the legal fallout started, an unauthorized construction, harassment claims, civil liability, her life began to implode. Her husband couldn't take the heat. As a bank manager, he needed to stay above scandal, and he wasn't going to risk his career to defend the power trip gone nuclear. Within 6 weeks, their house was on the market to below asking price. By autumn, they were gone, moved out of state, disgraced and forgotten. Maria said it best: "Some people write their own downfall with arrogance and blind pride. My real victory? It wasn't just keeping the boat. It was helping turn our HOA from Miranda's dictatorship into a community built on truth and fairness. Property values even went up after the dust settled because buyers want neighborhoods with clear rules and honest leadership. We rewrote the HOA charter to prioritize property rights, respectful dialogue, and actual legal boundaries. I was elected to a permanent advisory seat not because I wanted power, but because people finally trusted me to protect what's fair. And now, we hold an annual fishing tournament. Kids splash in the pool with my permission. Neighbors enjoy their homes again without fear of fines or fabricated rules. The clipboard tyranny is over. It's Saturday morning, my line's in the water, sun's up, peaceful. 6 months ago, I was being bullied off my dock. Now, I leased the clubhouse that never belonged to them in the first place. I didn't sue. I didn't scream. I just brought the truth and let the paperwork do the talking. If you loved watching justice served with calm confidence, hit like and subscribe to Anna Drama Nest. Got an HOA nightmare or power-hungry neighbor story? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. Because the truth, sometimes the best way to break a bully a broken bar is to let them talk themselves into ruin. See you in the next story where the clipboard always crumbles.